Hey folks, Mara here. Hope you're all well, and welcome to my Ret Double Legendary TED Talk. Two things before we go into this video. Firstly, this is just literally going to be a TED Talk. There's no gameplay footage, and the reason for that goes into the second reason, which is I have exams tomorrow and early next week, which means I cannot dedicate the time, or I cannot comfortably dedicate the time to getting a gameplay video out with the breakdowns as much as I'd like to, because that will take me 8-9 hours, and I can't really afford those 8-9 hours and, still comfortably look myself in the mirror between that and my exams. So this is going to be a quick video because I want to get my thoughts out there and my discussions on how things are looking and the feely crafty side of things. I will bring up the other screen, so that you can see kind of talents as I'm quickly talking about things and my thought process as I was testing, and we will look to get a full video out at a later date, probably Thursday, Friday of next week, assuming that we still have access to the double legendaries and Blizzard don't change the PTR too much in that time. So, swapping to the main screen then. As some of you know, the Ret tier set is still busted. The Seraphim is overwriting when you get Art of War, hence the very weird setup I have going currently. The reason for that is because if you want to play the 1 minute build as we traditionally know it, which would be this, with, these two talents being like whatever the hell you fancy, Blade of Wrath is proccing a little bit too much if you have the Forset. So I did try playing around with Fires of Justice. This was purely to make it so that I was having only a 12% proc chance on Art of War, rather than the 24% that you have with the Blade of Wrath. Now, playing with the 1 minute build still feels okay, and as a result, for the most part at least, legendaries like Final Verdict, Magistrate's Judgment, Dusk of Dawn, interestingly enough, because of the damage increase and how easy it is to get to that 5 holy power consistently, all feel really good. Specifically the Final Verdict and Magistrate's Judgment. Those two are the more interesting options. One plays around the harder hitting playstyle that we're accustomed to with the 1 minute build, and the other one kind of plays more into a consistent build, because remember, you've the Divine Resonance judgments that we get, especially through Ring and Clarity, have a chance to cause a proc of Magistrate's Judgment and reduce the cost of our holy power spenders. More judgments equals more procs of Magistrate's Judgment, and the spec kind of flows a little bit better. The Dusk of Dawn, not a legendary we've seen much use out of, purely because of the fact that getting up to 5 holy power and then back down to 0 constantly is a pain. But if we start playing with more haste, being able to get up to 5 holy power really quickly isn't really a problem, especially if you Divine Toll. Whether it be one target and you get Ring and Clarity procs, which may happen when talking about conduits, but we can do that in another video, and then getting back down to 0 for the damage reduction, may be a thing with a double legendary. Playing around with it generally at the moment, though, is a bit hit and miss. It seems better more in cleave situations rather than in pure single target patchwork settings. Relentless Inquisitor as well I found to be rather interesting. Same with Vanguard's Momentum. Both of these hinge on where our stat weights are going to be. Now, if we start valuing haste because we want more Art of War procs, this does push us away from the 1 minute build at this point, though, because we'll be looking at trying to game Art of War procs, more wake resets, and things like that. But having 5% haste on top of our normal stats could potentially be very, very huge. It depends on how we value haste. Although Relentless Inquisitor is devalued when we start playing things like Crusade rather than Final Reckoning. Vanguard's Momentum, on the other hand, I find really interesting, because that is essentially an execution option for us. It's not the greatest execution option, especially if you're playing Kyrian, because Hammer of Wrath has 1 extra charge and increases the holy damage done by 4% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 3 times. Now, outside of Avenging Wrath, we can only use Hammer of Wrath on targets with less than 20% health. Now, if there's low ad cleave situations where the ads die really, really quickly, you can game Hammer of Wrath rather well by target swapping, a bit like Warlock Shard sniping, to get the damage increase. And with it having a second charge, you can get 8% damage bonus for 10 seconds, maybe even 12 if we're really lucky in cycling things through. Unfortunately, I haven't done any raid testing. For the fights, I've kind of been keeping that, relatively new so I don't burn out. And also I've had other commitments around that time. So I can't really tell you too much, but on paper, it feels nice to play with. Especially when you've got loads of people currently testing ads and you can just game around and kind of min-max everything. Moving away though from the 1 minute die hard build, I have been testing and playing around with a build like this. Now, this is pushing us down the path of consistent damage, high uptime consistent damage. Now, what do I mean by high uptime consistent damage? Well, playing the 1 minute build, the general damage profile enables us to be in a situation where we only need uptime realistically for the point where we do the most damage. So every 2 minutes, well, every minute to 2 minutes, because we obviously have our 1 minute burst window and our 2 minute burst window. During those windows, we only need to be at the boss for 10, 15 seconds to get all the damage out, and then we kind of just treacle through for the next 40, 50 seconds, which is fun and has its perks, certainly, but it does also have its limitations. And for a lot of people, it is really, really disheartening to have kind of a moment where you funnel everything into as much damage as you physically can. And unfortunately, where paladins sit at the moment, we can do that, but we will still get out DPS'd by a monk with a proc, or we'll still only be middle of the pack for some fights. It's not a true glory moment. It is with Bloodlust, and at the start of the fight you can, pop 30, 40k, which is great, but then you might see a boomy pop 50. So it's each to their own. Having a consistent high uptime build, though, means that we're looking at rather changing it from, being able to only have those 15, 16 seconds of uptime every minute in order to do our maximum potential damage, and the rest is kind of just treacle damage. A little just, Crusader Strikes and the odd Templar's Verdict crit, maybe. We're looking at actually trying to keep it so that our uptime on the boss is close to 100% as we physically can, which means that you're going to have to be aware of movement points within the fight. Do you have to pre-move with Steed? Are you going to need to gear slightly for consistent movement so you can literally chase the boss to a point to keep the uptime as much as possible without gaming yourself? So having things like Zeal to increase your attack speed, or even Righteous Verdict. I'll talk about Righteous Verdict in a second though. So having Zeal to increase your attack speed, increasing your Art of War procs. Having something like Divine Purpose was something I was testing because I was just treating Seraphim as though I won't be touching Seraphim, and this was me trying to work around the current bug. So playing with Divine Purpose and Sanctified Wrath rather than Final Reckoning, and it enabled me to treat any Wake of Ash reset as free spell usage. So I was just using it on cooldown and kind of playing with it and playing through a faster, more active rotation where you were having to make judgment calls based on what you had available to you. And while playing with as Kyrian, I also decided to play around a little bit with Mechanikos, primarily because Mechanikos has that ability to reduce the cooldown on Divine Toll. Because you've got to remember, Divine Toll is a minute cooldown baseline, but especially in like cleave situations, so say for instance an ad spawns a bunch of mobs, you can very, very quickly make full use of it and get it down to a 45-second cooldown or a 40-second cooldown, so that if you don't get any wake resets, you can then just Divine Toll and wake. It's something I've had discussions with people in the past when it comes to kind of where this double legendary meta might see us in Mythic Plus. But that's, like, talking about the conduits and stuff goes into a whole different kettle of fish, so we can do that with a guide video or something later. It's, fine. So, back to the kind of legendary combinations then, seeing as we're going way down the rabbit hole. Kind of discussed the Kyrian stuff. because, you know, Divine Resonance is a fantastic legendary, but it synergizes best with certain legendaries of other calibers, so like the Magistrate's Judgment, as we discussed. Going into Necrolord, though, and that is the Gavel, or Duty-Bound Gavel. Vanquish's Hammer gains 1 additional charge, and an additional cast of Templar's Verdict will automatically trigger Divine Storm. Now, Duty-Bound Gavel itself is interesting because it generates Holy Power and has a 30-second cooldown. And if you're playing Marilith, also applies a debuff to the target where they take 6% more damage from you. And playing with the tierset and Marilith, being able to cycle, because I've also done this in previous videos as well, being able to cycle through a build where you're running with Righteous Verdict, Divine Purpose, Sanctified Wrath, because you got to bear in mind that free Divine Storm also generates Sanctified Wrath, because although it's free, it's still casting as it had Holy Power, like a Divine Purpose cast. Still works. But I was able to maintain an 85-90%-ish uptime on the Righteous Verdict buff. So pairing Vanquish's Hammer with Final Verdict resulted in some very, very strong, very, very meaty Templar's Verdict or Final Verdict casts, and had a huge amount of sustained damage, on par with the 1 minute build at the time of testing. Now, that is fantastic, because it gives us a different option, it gives us a unique option. Unfortunately, though, it does mean that this build is highly susceptible to movement. So if you're in a position where the boss, you know, fucks off to the other end of the room, or does something it's not supposed to, and you're caught out not having a Cavalier charge, or not having a Divine Steed charge, or, you know, there isn't a Warlock gateway, and, you know, movement's not planned, this build will suffer massively. As will Necrolord in general, because Necrolord is much more based, because of the fact that it has a 30-second cooldown window for its Covenant ability and the 6% damage increase that you get from that, it looks more at having high uptime, whereas the Kyrian build at current favors lower uptime, more damage. So they're my initial Feelycraft playthrough thoughts. Before I do go any further, in terms of Mythic Plus, regardless whether you're using Duty-Bound Gavel or Divine Resonance, the legendary of choice for Mythic Plus will be Tempest of the Lightbringer. We're likely to see more gain from Necrolord within the AoE settings, purely because of the fact that we will be able to prioritize single target damage into something with the Temples, or with the Templar's Verdict, into a free Divine Storm that is then going to be replicated by Tempest. And that is replicated. Again, something I have tested previously. So, M+, Tempest of the Lightbringer is just kind of going to be the go-to. There's no doubt about it. But for everything else, hopefully you guys have kind of liked this video. I will, next week, after my exams, get down to a full breakdown and record everything, put it into maths, and test it all for you. And hopefully it helps you guys. If you have any questions in the meantime, do feel free to contact me, and I will get back to you as quickly as I can. In the meantime, though, I hope you have a good week, good weekend, and all have a chill time. Happy hunting. Catch you later.